Hey, what's up with you guys? Hey, welcome back to another video. Now, this is going to be first of a kind of series of stuff as far as the first phase of TBC, balanced Druid and TBC, all the kinds of things that I think are significant to kind of go over and I feel like are worth making a video on. So this is going to be macros and kind of our general rotation as they kind of go hand in hand a little bit with some of the stuff here we're going to talk about, but that's what I'm going to cover in this video. Macros are a really big part of my overall gameplay, just as far as ease with shifting and just being able to use all of our hybrid abilities easily and quickly and effectively. I find Druid to be arguably the most macro intensive class just to play in general. Obviously it gets a little bit different when we're talking about like arenas and stuff like that, but there's a lot of things that default will not function the way that I think is the most optimized way for them to function. And so that's why we have a lot of different macros. And so let's go ahead and get into it. Now, there's a lot of shifting macros here, and I'll put these down in the description. That is going to be a big part of it, but there are a lot of these that will basically auto power shift you. So I don't want to necessarily go through all of these, but let's go through the Moonkin one, for example. This is a little bit longer here. As you can see, I actually do have this as Swiftmend as well. So this one keybind, if I inspect resto for whatever reason, this same keybind will be a mouse over Swiftmend macro. That's why this is in the bottom. This does nothing if I'm spec balanced because I don't have the ability Swiftmend because we're not down the resto tree, but I use this kind of as like a 2-for-1 keybind. So it's either Moonkin form or it's Swiftmend because I'm never going to be able to have both in any build. So that being said, it has a cancel form and then a dismount and an actual exclamation point cast Moonkin form. And what that's going to do is if I shift into Moonkin form here, you can see if I press this keybind again, this is my macro, it will power shift me. You see that cloud and you can see my mana going down. This is actually power shifting me out of Moonkin form and back in, but to a point where you can't visually see it, which helps from keeping you from getting in scenarios where you try to power shift and get caught in human form and lose all of your armor value that you would be getting from Moonkin form, because you can see in Moonkin form we have almost 10k armor. So we don't want to be doing stuff against rogues and warriors and things like that where we could get caught in human form, and so that's why this is actually really helpful to have this macro like this. Now, the way this will also work is I have a similar one here with travel form. You can see if I hit it again, the cloud goes, it power shifts into travel form. These macros will also work, just power shifting directly into each other normally. Now you can see there, if I do it really quick, I do go in human form if I switch between forms on the global cooldown. It has to do with if it's on global cooldown or not, but you can basically effectively just spam this and then spam it again, and it shouldn't be an issue unless you get caught in that global. That's the only time it kind of gets problematic. Now, on to a couple kind of ability macros here. I have both Force of Nature and Hurricane are on mouse over macros. Now, what mouse over, or sorry, it's at cursor, not mouse over, it's at cursor macros. But if you guys are using Hurricane normally, you'll click the ability, this pops up, and then you have to click somewhere on the ground. The way I have it set up, oh shoot, of course it did that. But the way I have it set up is it's actually at my cursor. So wherever my cursor is at the time of casting is where it's going to cast. I can show you, for example, here with trees, I have these as at cursor. So like if I hover over the skeleton and I cast my trees, they just immediately pop. I don't have to click and then click again to get the trees to spawn where the reticle is at. It just does it right at my cursor. This seems like it wouldn't be a very big deal, but that is actual valuable time that you're losing. Very hard to be casting on the reticle. Like if you're on the move, for example, say you're using your left hand to like, you know, WASD, run around or jump, you know, whatever. If you try and cast with the reticle and then have to click again, it's a lot of stuff to try and manage all at one time. And on abilities like Hurricane, Force of Nature, these are pretty obvious where you're trying to cast them, and having any kind of like real specific finesse is not usually necessary. So I haven't had any problems with these being at cursor macros, and they help kind of just speed up that gameplay in general. Now, let's talk about help harm macros here real quick. Oops, I didn't mean to hit that one. Help harm macros are basically going to allow you to use one keybind to use both an offensive spell and a defensive spell. So for example, Moonfire and Rejuvenation. If I have an enemy targeted, it's going to Moonfire them. If I have an ally either targeted or moused over, it's going to cast a Rejuve. Now, these were something I still use a lot of these abilities you'll see here. Like these are healing spells because I don't have anyone targeted. And if I click this mob, they turn into damage spells. That's because these are all set up as help harm macros. So I have like max rank regrowth. is my max rank Moonfire. I have my Lifebloom is macroed to my max rank Starfire. So I use this in my core gameplay. This is the way I play. And some of you guys might find it helpful, but one thing that did get changed with TBC that you need to be aware of is if you have anything that's set up to be a heal. So for example, I target myself, and if I hit Lifebloom, it's auto going to shift me out of Moonkin form. This took me a little while to get used to on TBC launch because this is not how it worked in original Classic. It would basically have like a little cursor and you'd have to either cancel form or it would tell you you're in the wrong form. However, in TBC, it will auto shift you out of a form if you're casting a spell that's not supposed to be cast in that form. Hopefully that makes sense the way I'm saying that. But basically, if I'm in Moonkin form and I hit any healing ability, it's going to auto shift me out. This isn't necessarily problematic, but you need to be very aware of where your cursor is or what you have targeted because you can accidentally be shifting yourself in and out of Moonkin form, trying and accidentally healing people basically. So if you're very comfortable with your abilities or you've used mouse over macros at all in the past, this is probably something that would be fine for you. This is a little more of like an advanced, arguably kind of an unnecessary thing, but it's a playstyle I've gotten used to in all of Classic and just all the content that I've done as Druid, Balanced Druid specifically. And so having that like help harm kind of playstyle with my main keybinds is a really kind of integral part to how I play. So I figured it would be worth mentioning it. I'll go ahead and I'll link one of these down below. You basically can just do the same thing and you put your, change the helpful spell to whichever helpful spell you want, change the harmful spell to whichever harmful spell you want, and it will work pretty straightforward. So that's pretty much it. Now, the other thing is mouse over buff macros. So I have this set up on both my Thorns, Mark of the Wild, and Innervate, where I just have to mouse over. So like if I have my raid frames, if you watched any of the raids or anything, I'll have my raid frames up here on my left, and I could just mouse over someone, hit my Innervate macro, it'll cast it here on me because there's no frames. But if I just mouse over the frame, it will innervate that person. I don't have to switch targets. I don't have to click on them and nothing like that. I can stay targeted on the boss if I need to watch for a spell that's being cast or anything like that. Same thing with the mouse over on Mark of the Wild and Thorns. These are really helpful, kind of just more basic quality of life stuff. They're not absolutely necessary, but once you get used to them, you can also do this with Rebirth. I have this as well as a mouse over macro, just really helpful and kind of just helps with the overall fluidity of your, utility spells and buffs and things like that. Now, Trinkets. I have, this is the one that I'm using. Actually, wait, neither of those are right. It's this one. So /use 14, /use 13, /cast Starfire. Now, what this is going to do is because in my PvE scenario, we've been using like a setup like this or using the Scryer's Blood Gem where we have 2 on-use trinkets. The batching is not nearly as problematic in TBC as it was in Classic. In Classic, it would be very hard where you would basically batch your Starfires together and your trinkets would never go off if you were just continually spamming Starfire. Luckily, we have a little bit more variety to our rotation and this macro does work. So 13 and 14 are in reference to our trinket slots here. And then /cast Starfire obviously is going to just cast Starfire. This allows us to basically activate the trinket and then just start immediately casting Starfire. So a lot of times I'll have, this is the macro that's right here. So for example, if I go over here and I hit this button, it'll hit, oh, it's over here actually, sorry, I moved it. I move it when it's in PvP, I change it. But so if I spam this button, you see it's just the icon of the trinket, but it's actually casting my Starfire. So this will activate the trinket and then cast our Starfire. And then once that trinket goes on cooldown, you'll see this comes back up in 5 seconds. If I hit this again, my trinket in my 14 slot will go on cooldown. Now the way I really do this to optimize is these are actually switched. So I use my minute 30 cooldown trinket first. Then I use my 2-minute trinket. Then my 1-minute 30 trinket is going to be back up sooner. This allows you to fit basically more trinket on uses in like a 3-4 minute window if you get lucky, but you can obviously switch this however you guys find necessary. If you only have one on use type trinket, then you could just you still use the same macro and it'll still work. That's why I like it without having the trinket names, because if I decide to like swap to the blood gem or whatever, I don't have to change my macro. The macro just always works. And let's go through, I think that's kind of all of the main macros here. Oh, Prowl, and let's talk about these. These are actually really big ones too. Dash and Prowl So this Prowl macro is absolutely insane. This Prowl macro will shift you into cat, put you in stealth, and cast track humanoids, and you can spam it and not pull yourself out of stealth. So for example, say we're flying here and this is an enemy player that I want to run up on. I can go ahead and hit that button, and I spam that button, and you see it shifts me into cat, dismounts me, and goes stealth, and I can keep spamming it and it doesn't shift me out. Now this global that you're seeing occurring is my track humanoids. You can see it right here kind of lighting up. My track humanoids is going off. That's why it's like triggering that global, but it keeps me in stealth the entire time. This is a very good like, oh shit button, a very good I need to go AFK button. It's just all around insane for PvP, allowing you to just immediately basically go invis to, you know, presumably get the jump in a world PvP scenario. Very, very strong. Now, I have the same thing here for dash. So for example, if I'm running, I could be in any form. If I hit, let's go bear form, and then I want to sprint, I hit this macro and it shifts me into cat and then casts sprint immediately in one global. So I don't have to shift into cat and then hit my sprint button. I just basically use it like a rogue sprint, and it auto shifts me into cat form prior to casting dash. So both of those very, very good, huge quality of life changes, especially as balanced druid. Those are really like the two main reasons you end up using cat form a lot, is to use your dash and to go stealth and like either open with stealth, with pounce, or with a clone out of stealth or whatever. And so I use these macros all the time. Super, super helpful. I think that that's really everything from a macro perspective as far as what I cast. The other thing I should mention is the cancel form macro. Now this is just a /cancel form /dismount, very basic. Also not necessary, but I got in a real big habit of using this in classic, and this is a good way to give yourself the option of shifting out of any form that you're in at the time. For example, this doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen, and you have the flexibility with this macro to do this, is for example, if say I want to cast on this guy and I want to start DPSing him, but halfway through my cast, I realize I want to start healing myself. What I can basically do is be casting this Starfire. I can hit my cancel form. It will actually cancel the form mid-cast, where I'm already then in human form ready to do whatever it is that I'm trying to do. It doesn't come up a lot, like I said, but it is nice just to have that flexibility, because you can shift out off the global cooldown while you're casting. It doesn't cancel your cast, so there's just kind of not really a reason to not have access to it. And I've gotten used to it, and there's certain combinations of like shifting different forms or using different abilities in different forms, and sometimes just manually shifting or manually dismounting is just something I've gotten in the habit in. Now, that's pretty much it as far as I can think on the macro stuff. But let me show you guys some openers and kind of how I've been playing dungeons and things like that in general, and raid encounters. So what I've been doing more so in dungeons, because our threat is a little bit problematic as far as once you start getting geared, depending on what kind of tanks you have. Certain tanks are obviously able to pump way better threat right now than others, and it can be problematic with pulling threat. So couple things that you guys should know. Insect Swarm generates 0 threat on actual initial application of the spell. The only time it starts generating threat is each dot tick, and each time it's dealing damage, it does generate threat based on that damage. Fairy Fire has a fixed amount of threat. Fairy Fire, I believe, has 132 threat. So if we see up here, yeah, top left, you can see I have 132 threat on this tree right here. Okay, and that's just from that Fairy Fire cast. So a lot of people don't know this, but it's something that you need to know, because what will happen is if your tank, say your tank body pulls or shoots like with an arrow and it misses or something, if you cast Fairy Fire, you're going to get immediate aggro, because Fairy Fire has a base value of threat on it. It's kind of weird. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but that's something that you should know, because it'll be problematic in raid encounters and in dungeons. If you don't know that. Insect Swarm, however, you can see here, actually, I'm going to reset this because I already have, this will be kind of confusing mathematically if I already have 2,000 threat on this target. Insect Swarm, though, will generate 0 threat, and it will generate threat on the first dot tick, which happens 3 seconds after the application. So what that means is that you can actually open with Insect Swarm and not have risk of pulling off of your tank, assuming that your tank is the one that pulled. Then what I usually will do is that gives that first global. Then I'll Fairy Fire off of that, as that's our next kind of lowest threat ability. And then I'll Moonfire. The reason I do it in that order is basically least to most threat, and that gives the tank the most time to potentially build up a threat lead on the target. So let me show you here. If I hit Insect Swarm, you can see up here on the tiny threat, it'll say 0. 0. Then once the dot tick occurs, then this will tally up the threat based on the dot tick. But that's 3 whole seconds from the initial cast of that Insect Swarm. So what I've been doing as my kind of go-to opener in a scenario, if I'm trying to basically kind of like pre-cast and go on pull, is I'll actually open with a Wrath at the time that the tank is pulling. Reason being is that Wrath is obviously not going to generate any threat while it's traveling. It will generate threat once it starts hitting the target. That's about the time that you cast your Fairy Fire. Presumably the tank at that point has had 1 or 2 globals to generate threat on the target, and it should not be problematic. If it starts being a little bit iffy, or if you're bad at timing the Wrath, or you're worried about threat, take the Wrath out of the equation, wait for your tank to actually be on the boss or whatever it is that you're fighting, and then cast Insect Swarm, and just don't forget about the pre-cast of the Wrath. But I'll basically go Wrath into Insect Swarm, which is generating 0 threat until right there, and then I Fairy Fire like off of that Insect Swarm global, then we Moonfire, and then we go into our full rotation. That really gives the tank as much time as possible while still allowing you to do a lot of DPS. That Insect Swarm global being early on in that rotation, the Wrath giving him a couple seconds of that projectile travel time to like get that threat built up, all of that. That's what I have found to be the most effective in like a 5-man dungeon scenario, and even in a lot of raid encounters, I'll use that in the opener if I think that threat might be an issue on pull. If you open up with a Starfire into a Moonfire right off the bat, very likely that you're going to rip aggro if the tank hasn't had 4 or 5 seconds to generate threat, just because it just does so much damage. Now that being said, that's kind of like my general go-to opener for threat scenarios, but in a raid environment, I was looking at the logs, and I've gotten this question a lot, and I feel like I should talk about it in this briefly. A lot of people are running the Sunfire set, which is the arcane and fire damage gear, and they're running that in a raid environment, in like, you know, gruels, mag, things like that. People are using that as the kind of default stuff. They're also using the badge offhand, like I have here, the one that's just all spell damage, but they're using the one that's arcane damage specific. People are using the Sunfire enchant rather than the 40 spell damage. People are itemizing to maximize arcane damage. That seems to be the highest performing raid DPS setup that currently is on Warcraft logs. If you're using that setup, you basically always are casting Moonfire and Starfire, and that's it. You can be using Insect Swarm in the opener, like I said, as a way to kind of get uptime early and kind of front load some damage without generating threat, which is kind of the application that Insect Swarm really has value as far as our overall DPS. And in situations where we have to move, we can obviously use Insect Swarm then. But outside of those two things, is either on pull or on movement, you don't really want to be using Insect Swarm or Wrath if you're itemizing that way. Me personally, I don't think I'm going to go with the Sunfire gear just because it's really expensive, and that stuff is really, really pricey on our server. But presumably, we might try some of that in the future if we can get our hands on it. But I'm not going to gear too hard that way. I'm not going to do the Sunfire enchant and all that stuff because it's just like, I don't have the gold to be able to manage all that. So, but if you guys are on either a lower pop server or you are really rich, by all means, go for it and try that, because that seems to be the setup that people are running, and they're absolutely pumping when I look at the logs. So that does seem to be the highest performing setup as it is right now. So with that being said, guys, that was really it. I wanted to get all those macros out. That's all the main macros and things I've been using, the main rotation and stuff that I've been using. We have gruels and all that fun stuff coming up. I have Carrot tomorrow. I want to post all of that stuff up for you guys to check out. Let me know down below if you guys have any questions, any kind of content you guys are genuinely curious to see, so I know what kind of stuff to make that you guys are interested in watching. But like always, guys, thanks so much for hanging out. I really do appreciate it. Hit that sub button if you guys aren't subbed, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.